This is Situated, a podcast exploring how our surroundings shape us. And I'm your host, Sarah Robinson. Kate Jeffery is originally from New Zealand. She's a neuroscientist who completed her PhD at the University of Edinburgh and later went on to work as a postdoc with John O'Keefe, who won the 2014 Nobel Prize for his work on place cells at the University College London. She co-founded the company Axona Limited, which developed a recording system with which grid cells in the hippocampus were discovered. This instrument now resides in the Nobel Prize Museum in Stockholm. Kate stayed at UCL to become a lecturer and later professor, and there she founded and directed the Institute of Behavioral Neuroscience. And in 2022, she moved to the University of Glasgow to head the newly formed School of Psychology and Neuroscience. Kate, thanks so much for talking with me today.
It's a pleasure.
When I think of memory, when you close your eyes and imagine a moment in your life, you can't imagine it without the place that it was in. So this memory that's seemingly inside of you summons this whole outside world, and it seems like your research really has much to say about how that actually works.
Yes. So it's just something that's emerged in the last probably half century that, I think we've known from our subjective experience that memory and place are very closely linked. But science really started to make that link in the brain about the middle of last century, discovering that there's a system in the brain that seems to have the job of making a map of space and also of organising our memories so that they can be retrieved. So space and memory are really, really closely linked in the brain.
So one of the overarching themes in biology is that structure determines function. So how does the structure of the hippocampus relate to its function?
That's a very good and difficult question. So I think we don't know the answer to that fully yet. In mammals, it's a very intricately organised structure. If you look at a section of the brain on a brain scan or a microscope, slice or something, you can see this beautiful kind of interlocking structure, rows and rows of neurons that kind of curve around each other. And that motif, if you like, recurs all the way from the top of the hippocampus to the bottom. So it seems to have this very regular organisation. And that's made us speculate as to why it has that structure. And the answer is we don't know yet. And also we look in other animals, not mammals, and we find a very different organisation. So however the structure is determining the function, it's not really understood. It's something presumably to do with the connections and how the connections are organised. So not where things are in physical space, but how they're talking to each other.
In time? In
time, but also in space, like which neighbours is a neuron talking to and which isn't it, type of thing. So it's the flow of information through the network that causes its function. So it's a huge job to try and figure out how that all works.
So in one of your talks that I listened to, you were talking about this part of the hippocampus that's almost like a pacemaker, or emits a signal to keep this theta rhythm.
Yes, there's a rhythm in the brain, particularly in the hippocampus, called theta rhythm, which is this very regular sort of oscillation up and down and up and down. So all of the neurons together will become more excited and then less excited and then more excited and less excited and so on. It's a very, very striking pattern to record. And there is a part of the brain, actually not in the hippocampus, it's just outside it, that seems to have the role of determining when this rhythm starts and how fast it will be. And the rhythm propagates all the way through the hippocampus, but also to many of the structures that are connected to the hippocampus. And we've been trying to understand for a very long time what might be the function of this beautiful oscillation. And I think it has something to do with synchronizing these areas of the brain so that they're all excitable at the same time, and that means that they'll talk. It's like waking everything up at the same moment, and then exchanging messages, and then everything goes quiet again. But quite why and how that happens, we still don't know. Mostly we get this information from studying rats and mice, and in rats and mice we see this theta rhythm when the animals get up and walk around, or when they're sort of attentive to something, so they're kind of awake and they're either moving or they're thinking of moving or something. And then when they're quiet and relaxed, the theta rhythm goes away and we get a different kind of rhythm. And we think that something similar also happens in humans, but the frequencies are slightly different, but everything else seems to be similar. So it's probably quite a fundamental function.
And it's interesting that this theta rhythm, so we experience it when we have REM sleep,
Yes.
in learning and memory, and those things seem really different. I mean, being deep asleep and then learning seem to be opposite modes of being.
Yes. So, well, sleep is a complicated thing. So there are two broad categories of sleep. One of them is REM sleep that you just mentioned. REM stands for rapid eye movement, and we call it that because when you look at a sleeping person or a sleeping animal and they're in the REM state, you can see their eyes moving around it. It's as if they're looking at something, but their eyelids are closed and they're asleep, but they're dreaming. So this is the dreaming sleep. And during the dreaming phase of sleep, we do see theta. So the assumption is that the brain is creating an experience that's to do with movement or to do with the types of thing that make theta occur. And then there's another state called slow wave sleep, where the theta disappears and the brain rhythms kind of change, and you don't dream. And it's a very deep dreamless sleep. And we're still trying to work out what these phases of sleep are for, but I think most people think now that it's something to do with memory organisation and a process called consolidation, which is taking the memory and strengthening it in the brain, putting it in the right place, integrating it with previous memories and all of that kind of stuff. So I think my view on this, and I'm not an expert on sleep, but my view on the sleep state is that the animal or the person tries to disconnect themselves from the real world and everything that's going on, so that the brain can do this housekeeping and organising and filing and storing and so on, clearing out. So there's some evidence now that it's also clearing out junk proteins and things and kind of refreshing everything.
So that's really interesting that on some level, whatever level that may be, memory, learning, and dreaming have something importantly in common.
Yes, possibly, yes. Although much of the memory consolidation actually is in slow wave sleep when we're not dreaming. And we still don't know why we have dreaming sleep and non-dreaming sleep, but almost every animal that's been studied has these two types of sleep. And yes, it's very, very connected to memory and learning. And exactly what's going on. It's difficult to study experimentally because you can't deprive an animal of sleep, because they die if well, it's cruel for a start.
Yes.
Wouldn't want to do that to an animal. But also they die, like in experiments in the past where they have done that, the animals only survive a few days.
Well,
so it's really kind of fundamental process for life. We don't know why they die. But it makes it sort of difficult to find out what would happen to their memories if we didn't have sleep.
So it also seems the more we learn about the process of learning, that it has this rhythmic cycle. We can't always be on, we can't always be alert. There needs to be this daydreaming built in, this sort of repose, the downward curve of the rhythmic cycle.
Yes, so there's what they call the encoding phase of a memory, when you have an experience and your brain tries to store that experience. And then there's the consolidation phase that I mentioned, where that information gets sent to other parts of the brain and stored. And there's a lot of work trying to understand how that works and where do the memories go and how do they get found again, because you have millions and millions of memories, and yet we're quite good at finding the exact one that we need. So there's some very, very clever process that not only stores the memory but stores the location of the memory, and we think that the hippocampus is doing that. And then when you come to recall a memory, that's called retrieval. So that's the process where the brain puts together all of the bits of the memory. And our subjective feeling about memory recall is that we are replaying like a videotape or whatever we have these days, streaming. That the experience is kind of happening all over again in our minds. But actually, when you study the content of people's memories, we find that they're very inaccurate, and there are lots of differences from the original experience. And we now think that memory is more like a reconstruction than a replay. So it's almost like what's been stored as the ingredients to make the memory, but then you need to cook up the ingredients into your recipe, and so you're producing a memory that feels as though it was the original experience, but isn't. But from the point of view of the brain, that doesn't really matter, so long as the memory has all of the important information that will help you behave, adaptively in the real world. So it's a bit unnerving, I find, to think that you don't really recall your past experiences, you synthesize them again.
So it says a lot about the importance of being in the present moment, because it's really not going to happen again.
Exactly, yeah.
But also, studies on amnesia, they find that when you lose your memory, you also lose your ability to imagine.
Yes, so certain kinds of memory. So there's more than one kind of memory we now know. And we know this because of a very, very famous neuropsychological case that happened in the late 1950s of a young man who had surgery to try and cure his epilepsy. And the surgery involved removing the hippocampus on both sides. And when he woke from his surgery, he couldn't form any new memories of his life experiences. But he was able to learn some types of things. So we now think of these as, they're called procedural memories, like knowing how to do things. So he could learn how to do a thing, but he couldn't remember the experience of learning how to do that thing. So that told us that there were at least two kinds of memory. So the one that's to do with the experiences of life, that's called episodic memory. That depends on the hippocampus, as we learned from this young man's case. And studies of people with damage to the hippocampus find that not only can they not form new memories, but they can't imagine coordinated new scenes, I guess you could call it. So if you ask somebody with hippocampal damage to imagine a beach and to describe what they can see, they know the elements, they know that there's kind of sand and water and so on, but they can't put it together into an integrated scene, whereas a normal person will say, okay, I'm standing, at the edge of the sea. In front of me is sand on one side and then the sea on the other, and up ahead there are cliffs and there are trees. So they can make this integrated picture. It's as if they see it in their mind's eye. And so, it's very difficult to get into the mind of somebody who doesn't have a hippocampus. But my impression is that it would be like not having the mind's eye anymore. So not being able to see the scene, and that's not just for imagination but also for memory.
Wow, that's interesting, and I wonder how their dreams are.
That's a very interesting question, and I should know the answer to that, but I don't. I will go and look that up.
So I want to go into these other kind of memories in a question, but first I want to go back to the structure of the hippocampus and how close it is to the amygdala, and that relationship between them.
Yes, so the amygdala is a compact structure, almond-shaped, so that's why it's called amygdala, which means almond, apparently. And it's right next to the hippocampus. In humans, it's just to the front of the hippocampus, so our hippocampus is almost horizontal and the amygdala is at the front, if you like. So it runs from front to back, and the amygdala is at the front. In rats and mice, the hippocampus is more vertical, and the amygdala is kind of at the bottom end. And so it's very deep in the brain. And we are in the process of trying to work out what its function is, but it's something to do with emotional processing. It's been particularly linked with fear, as one of the dominant emotions that it's interested in. But I think as research goes on, we're starting to uncover more complexities to that. It has a lot of connections with the hippocampus, going in both directions. So the hippocampus talks to amygdala and is telling it things, presumably things like where we are and what's going on, and then the amygdala reports back to the hippocampus and helps it associate the emotional content of the experience with the location, I guess is one way of putting it.
Well, I think that says a lot, or it's very suggestive of why when we enter a scene, we immediately feel it's safe, it's dangerous, it has a mood, it's an immediate sense. And all the work and interest in atmospheres and architecture kind of comes out of this remarkable ability we have to sense the mood of a space. And it seems to me maybe that connection between feeling and memory, or this place setting that the hippocampus seems to be specialized in.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important connection, because it's really critical for survival to know about they call it valence, whether something is good or bad, makes you feel positive or negative about it. Really important to be able to have the correct valence associated with a place, because you need to avoid a dangerous place and go back to a place that was rewarding and so on. The main reason for having a sense of place is so that in future you know where to go. So that's what it's for. So yeah, the link between the emotional systems in the brain and the spatial cognitive systems in the brain is tremendously important.
And also the fact that the hippocampus is part of the limbic system, which we always refer to as, the really ancient part of the brain. So this is really clear in animals. I mean, any animal immediately finds their way in space and can find their way back with remarkable skill.
Yeah. It's a very ancient structure. So we are now starting to. We're not exactly working backwards in time, because we're looking at animals that are alive today. But what we can do is study other species that diverged from us in evolution a long time ago, and to the extent that those other species have the same things that we have, that tells us that ancestor from a long time ago had those things as well. We've both retained them. So we've been looking mainly at other mammals to start with, so particularly rats and mice, because they're the favourite laboratory animal. And we see very strong similarities in the hippocampus between the rats and the mice and ourselves. So that makes us think that at least 200 million years ago, or whenever the last ancestor was, there was a hippocampus that's pretty much like ours. So now we're starting to look at species that are a bit more distant. So birds, for example, which I think were maybe 300 million years ago or something, was the last common ancestor. And they have what looks like a really different brain from ours. They don't have all convoluted kind of cortex around the outside. Everything is differently organised. But we've been able to identify clusters of neurons in the bird brain that seem to be what's called homologous to the hippocampus in mammals. And the reason it's homologous is that the connections seem to be similar. When we look at how that part of the brain develops in the embryo, so the vertebrate embryos all start out very similar. And so you can look at the embryos and say, okay, these cells in the structure in the bird started out from the same place as these ones that in mammals ended up in hippocampus. So therefore we think this might be hippocampus. So you can just do lots and lots of kind of correlations like that and eventually conclude that there's a sort of a hippocampus-like structure in birds. And then most recently we've been looking at fish, where the common ancestor is even further back. And similarly, we see something that looks a bit like a hippocampus. And when it's damaged in fish or birds, they lose the ability to find their way around and so on. And recently we've developed new imaging techniques that mean that we can look at the activity of neurons in all of these different species, and we see a lot of similarities. So we think that this is a very ancient structure. And when you think about it, really as soon as animals started to move around, it really became adaptive for them to try and figure out where they were. So it's quite likely that if we look even further back, we'll see something that's the beginnings of the hippocampus.
So, place and, let's say, when we consider these things and study them deeply, the difference between the inside and the outside becomes quite thin. So where you are determines how you are and what you can do. I mean, in the case of the animal, the fish or the bird, they're so much part of their environment that, of course, they have to have this highly refined navigation system that only gets more complex as we evolve. But you've also said in the past that of the theories that are out there to sort of make sense of your data, that 4E cognition seem to be, the fact that the mind is embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended seem to make the most sense.
Yes. So there are different, I'm trying to think of the word, degrees of intensity, I suppose, of how psychologists think of this concept of embodied cognition. So some people really think that there isn't a meaningful distinction to be made between the brain and the world. We're all kind of one system. My view is that we are very much in the world. We evolved in the world we're in. Our sense organs are adapted for the types of sensory information that we will encounter in our lives. And our internal constructs, so when the brain is trying to make sense of its sensory perceptions, it's creating what we call knowledge, cognition. And those constructs are very much determined by the structure of the environment and what we call the affordances of the environment, so the things that the environment lets you do. So, for example, when we think about how the brain is making a mental map of space, it's not just making a global map of all of space. It seems to be making individualized maps for the different types of space that we might encounter. So whether we're in a big open space where we can move around freely, or whether we're walking along a narrow walkway or whatever, those types of constraints that come from the environment will constrain how the brain is organizing those sensory impressions. So that's my kind of take on enactivism. we are very much shaped by our environment, but we are still distinct from it. Everything that comes into us from the environment gets filtered through our senses into the brain.
So one of the beefs, if I can use that slang term, in active cognition is that they're anti-representation. So this idea that we have some sort of representation in our brain that's controlling our behavior, and we're referring to that. And sometimes when I think of the cognitive map, it sort of sounds like a representation.
Yes, yeah. So it's possible to have furious debates about words.
Yeah.
So cognitive map itself was a very, very contentious. It was a contentious idea, but also the term itself generated a lot of debate. Like what do we consider to be within the definition of a cognitive map? Let alone do we have one of those?
Yes.
And hours and hours and pages have been spent on trying to flesh out these ideas and come to some sort of agreement. But the conflict between people who think there is a representation in the brain and people who don't is a very old one, and I'm not sure if we'll ever get rid of it. And I think partly it's because we have different views of what we mean by representation.
Yeah.
So representation or map, they mean different things to different people. And I think some people, when you say there's a map in the brain, they go, well, that's ridiculous, because I know what a map is, and I know what the brain is, and there's just no way that you can have this thing and that thing. But really, the people like me who are using the word map mean it in a pretty abstract sense, which is there's an organisation of the connections in the brain that other parts of the brain can make use of to make predictions about what the senses are going to encounter pretty soon. And those predictions correlate with what's out there in the world. So, for example, if I'm walking down a street that I'm very familiar with and I'm coming to a corner, my brain is going, when you go around that corner, this is what you can expect to see. And you turn around the corner and then your eyes see a thing and they report back and say, this is what we can see. And then the brain goes, okay, that's good, that's what we were expecting, so everything's fine, we're where we thought we were. So none of this is in the brain, there's no corner in the brain, there's no street. There's just flows of information. But the flows of information enable you to do the appropriate thing, to be surprised or not to be surprised and so on. So it's really very abstract. And yet our subjective experience is almost like we're watching a video in our minds of what we're going to see when we go around the corner and so on. And so I think a lot of the debates in psychology have happened because some people think that other people are using the word representation in a more concrete way than I think they are.
Mm-hmm.
So, but then there are still people, even if you acknowledge that abstraction, there are still people who say, well, that's fine, you can mean a really abstract thing, but I still don't think it's there. And all I can do is appeal to the data. We look into the brain and we do see these patterns of activity that correspond to things going in the real world. So if that's not a representation of what's in the real world, then what is,
Yeah, so if it's a map, it's a three-dimensional map that's dynamically changing all the time.
Yes, yeah. But it's a map in the sense of there are correlations between what's going on in the brain, or correspondences, I guess is probably a better word, between what's going on in the brain and what's out there in the real world. But the domains are so different. I mean, it's like, for example, you look at words on a page and they mean something. So you look at the word apple, it means an apple, but there's absolutely no sense in which the word apple resembles an apple in any way.
Yes, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy.
But the word represents apple in the sense that it makes us do things that we would do if we were seeing a real apple. So that's I think what's meant by a cognitive map. It's this very abstract kind of organisation of information.
But that analogy is really revealing because it sort of also suggests the way memory works, because memory's so associative. So the way that language can describe an object, it seems our organization of our, let's call it the map, this three-dimensional dynamic map, represents our experience more than even, the experience being the synthesis of place and our actions.
Yes.
Which is what memory is.
Yes, yeah. So there is a distinction to be made between the spatial component of that memory and the things that are in that space. So, for example, I might be in a room with an apple. So I have a representation, I have a cognitive map of the room. But I also have in my brain somewhere a representation of apple, the concept apple, which is a complex representation that has a mix of vision. I know what an apple looks like. Sound, I know what it sounds like when you bite into it. Smell, taste, memories of experiences I've had with apples, all of this kind of stuff. So when the brain is synthesizing a memory and it knows it needs to recreate the space, and it also needs to put in that space apple, so it reaches into the bits of the brain that have all these components of the apple concept and puts them in there as well. So So we call that kind of knowledge about items and things is called semantic memory. So I know things about apples. So this young man that I told you about who had the surgery and lost his ability to form episodic memory, he still knew all of the things he knew about the world. So he knew what an apple was, and he had all of his semantic memories. And he, continued, I think, to some extent to learn new things about the things in the world. Just couldn't remember the personal experiences of encountering those things. So it's a very interesting separation between these different kinds of memory.
So speaking of different kinds of memory, in Gaston Bachelard's Poetics of Space, he writes about muscular memory, that the house we're born in is physically inscribed in us. It's a set of organic habits. And he talks about the feel of the tiny latch has remained in his hands as an adult, and the stretch of the stairs as he goes up them has remained in his muscles. And that's a similar thing to what the philosopher Hubert Dreyfus called a muscular gestalt. So I wonder how that relates to memory in the hippocampus and this sort of memory that's extended throughout our whole body.
That's a very interesting question. And I think the big insight that we got about that was the studies of this patient. His name is Henry Mollison. He's one of the most famous cases, or if not the most famous case in neuroscience, because we learned so much from him. And one of the very early findings made by Brenda Milner, who worked with him for a long time, is that his what you call muscular memory, which nowadays I think we would call procedural memory, so knowing how to do things, knowing things like walking up the stairs. When you walk up a familiar flight of stairs, you don't need to think about it, you don't even need to look, because you know how high the stairs are. It's in your muscles, if you like. And this kind of memory was preserved in Henry Mollison, so it doesn't depend on the hippocampus. When you experience these memories over and over and over, they become habits. So learning to drive a car, when you start out, you have to be told what to do, and you're kind of having to tell your limbs what to do. And then once you've done it enough, your limbs know what to do automatically. You don't need to think about it anymore. It becomes an unconscious automatic habit. And that depends on an entirely different system in the brain called the striatum. And it can function quite well without a hippocampus. It's handling a different kind of memory. And when you're finding your way around in the world, you can call on both of these systems to a greater or lesser extent. So if you're imagining where you want to go, then you'll use the hippocampus. If you're in a new place and you're trying to work out where things are, you'll use the hippocampus. But if you're in a very familiar location, you're walking to work and you've done that route 1,000,000 times and you're thinking about something else, listening to a podcast or whatever, then your muscle memory takes over. So your striatum, your habit memory, enables you to navigate. You just know what to do. You walk down to the corner and you turn right. You don't need to think about it. So yes, so that's a really profound distinction, that and a big insight for science and art to have discovered.
And also the role of habit. We think of habit as something that's numbing and boring, and it sort of makes us rigid, but it's actually liberating our energies to discover new things, because once these memories become practiced, they become part of our body and they free up our mental resources, it seems, to do other things.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's presumably why we've evolved these two systems, that you don't need to focus attention anymore on something that's well learned, provided nothing changes. If something changes, then your attention will be caught, your hippocampus will be switched on, there's something new is going on. But if nothing is changing, then why waste resources? Imagine driving a car and having to think about it every single time. It would be very tedious.
Overwhelming.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and so these two systems make us incredibly adaptive. Like how do these two systems play out in different animals?
I think it's fundamentally probably quite a similar function. obviously in, more complex brains like we have, it's probably doing more to a greater degree of complexity and detail and so on. But I think even in the earliest beginnings of the hippocampus, it was probably something to do with making an organised representation of the world and associating events with it. So, if something bad happens, you get threatened by a predator, you stamp that into your memory. So I think that function is just tremendously important. For any animal that moves around, it needs to know what to expect from the different places it might move to.
So what is the entailment? Okay, so the motor system must be really tightly linked to this procedural memory, this striatum, is that what you called it? Yeah. How does the motor system play into the hippocampus?
So, the hippocampus and the striatum talk to each other. So, do you mean how is the spatial map informing the movements?
Yes.
So I think, I'm probably not going to give a very good answer here because it's a slightly hand-waving one. It's slightly outside my expertise because I'm not a striatal person. But I think when you are first in a new environment and doing things like walking down a new street and turning a new corner and so on, your hippocampus is clocking what's going on, and your movement system in the brain is storing a memory of what you just did, and those things are linked together to some extent, so that when you next go to that place, the hippocampus says, I recognise this place, we've done this before, and the motor system starts to organise its movements similarly to how it did before, and as you've done that a few times, eventually the movements get stamped into the motor system, and you no longer need to consciously think about it. So I'm not sure if that's a very good answer.
I think it is because it really underlines the role of practice.
Yes, yeah.
Practice in forming habits.
Yes, and also the distinction between perception and action of a place depending on whether it's really familiar to you or unfamiliar to you. And I think that's something very important in architecture, actually, is that, if you're designing something like a train station, for example, some of your people that you're designing for will be commuters who have just done this a million times, and others will be tourists who've never been here before. And they have a different way of processing the information that's there. And so you need to think about how to provide information that serves the needs of those different types of people. There are also individual differences, actually, in the extent to which people rely on this more habit-based system, route learning, so learning a sequence of actions versus having a more global map-based approach. So I think individual differences are very important to think about, and the different types of information that the different systems in the brain need.
What has been the most remarkable or interesting part of working more with architects, because you are unique among neuroscientists, I think, because you're really trying to apply this knowledge.
Yeah, so it's been very interesting working with architects because we think so differently, and yet we have this common interest in spatial experience. And I think the biggest difference, I think, is that architects seem to be focused quite heavily on the valence of the experience. So if we get back to that word about the pleasurableness of the experience and so on, how does a person feel about this space? As a cognitive neuroscientist, I find myself thinking, what does a person know about this space? And to my mind, these two things are linked very strongly together. We've seen hippocampus and amygdala and so on and so on. The emotional and the cognitive parts of the brain talk to each other very intensively. And to me, your knowledge about a space is a very critical part of your experience of that space. So I get the feeling, and possibly I'm being, I'm sure I'm overgeneralizing here, but I have the feeling that architects, when they design a space, imagine that that space is going to have the same effect on everybody. So this is, they talk about almost the properties of the space. This is an imposing space. This is an awe-inspiring space. This is a comforting space or a homey space. But really, we now know that we're embodied, we have an embodied relationship to our environment, and enclosed within our bodies and brains is a very complex cognition that you bring with you into a space, your past experiences of similar spaces. You might walk into a space and think, this reminds me of the subway where I was attacked 10 years ago. I feel really uncomfortable in this space. Yes. Whereas somebody else walks in and thinks, oh, I love the clean lines and the smooth walls and the curving. So people are bringing different experiences and memories and understanding of a space into it. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot as I experience different spaces is how much I feel my comfort with a space depends on understanding, my cognitive understanding of the space, knowing where things are, knowing what's around that corner, knowing which way I'm facing, knowing how to get back to the exit, all of those things, just having this sense that I have a map of the space that goes beyond my immediate perception. And if I had one message for architects, it would be to think about the space beyond immediate perception and how important that knowledge is to the perception of the space you're in right now. Because I'm not sure that that's something that's thought about very much.
Oh, that's really interesting, and that's great advice. But you've also been involved in, I read a paper that you wrote on, the role of science in climate change. We think, we tend to think technology is going to save us, and then there's the contribution that science could make in helping us understanding the psychology of being overwhelmed and all the reasons people don't act in climate change. Mm-hmm. But what's little discussed, as you pointed out, is science's contribution to climate change, the footprint of doing science, especially neuroscience, which is quite intensively resource, so many resources go into it.
Yes. Science is very carbon producing. Architecture is as well, I should say. Building, the construction industry is responsible for a huge proportion of global emissions.
But those are being addressed, not at the pace that they should be, but it seems like the footprint of science hasn't been hardly touched upon.
Yes, I agree, and I do think it's something we need to think about.
Just the cost of, not just the monetary costs, but the climate costs and the petroleum-based dependence of doing scientific experiments.
Yes, yeah. So I'm sort of grappling in my mind with the problem of climate change, which I think is an existential threat. And the reason I think that is that when I look around, I see carbon-producing industries springing into being and growing rapidly at a much faster pace than I see sustainability industries trying to.
So alarming.
So for a good example of that is machine learning and artificial intelligence, which has really just come about to a noticeable scale in the last few years and is increasing exponentially. So the amount of energy that it takes to train these large language models and to use them. And this is just an industry that we know about. So 10 years from now, a new industry may well come into being that's also producing unstoppable amounts of carbon. So I'm now of the view that we are not going to solve this problem by individual organisations trying to reduce their own carbon footprint. I think that the only thing that can save us is a global concord, or whatever you call it, agreement that we will collectively stop producing carbon. So if a new industry emerges and it's producing carbon, well, too bad. We need to constrain it.
Yes.
We need to somehow, I don't know how, but maybe we need to kind of have a carbon accounting system or something, like we have a global economy, we need a carbon economy or something. We've got to do something.
Yes, absolutely.
Because what we're doing right now manifestly isn't working.
But also this human need to keep exploring, which is so much part of being human. And science is, this endless source of new frontiers, one after the other. And in that paper you mentioned as one of the possible solutions or considerations, slow science, which was quality over quantity. Where do you stand on that?
Yes, I mean, I think we do have an issue of quantity, and that's getting bigger and bigger. That's also growing exponentially as new technologies come along, and we're generating huge amounts of data, and the processing of that data generates huge amounts of carbon. And I think, we're getting to the point where we have more data than we really know what to do with. So I think there is an argument for sort of stepping back and saying, look, we need to sort of think that just because we can do something, should we do it? Just because we can record 1 million neurons at once, should we? Or should we think about what it is we really want to know? I think in every industry we need to be thinking, should we be doing the things that we can do, or should we be restraining ourselves? But like I said just before, I don't think we can solve this problem by just doing that. I think there needs to be some top-down control of our activities, which does go against the grain. I mean, humans don't like to be controlled from above. And we see this with our political organisation. If a government becomes too authoritarian, it gets overturned. And I think that's why I think it's an existential threat, because I'm not convinced that there is a solution. But I very much hope that there is, because I do think humans are amazing, and we do have this capacity to go further than any species has ever gone into the universe, and I would love to see that realised. But I think we need to solve some very big problems first.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you, Kate. Thank you for listening to Situated. Tune in next time for more conversations exploring how our surroundings shape us.